You are not here by accident. Something within you, quieter than conscious thought and considerably older than any deliberate decision you have ever made, directed you to this precise moment. And by the time you have fully absorbed what is shared here, you will begin to understand exactly why. Perhaps lately you have been carrying an exhaustion that no amount of rest genuinely resolves. Not the ordinary tiredness that follows a demanding week or a difficult month. Something deeper and stranger than that. A weariness that accumulates not from doing too much, but from feeling too much. From absorbing, without adequate relief or adequate understanding, the emotional weight of every environment you inhabit, every person you encounter, every unspoken tension that the people around you seem to navigate without appearing to notice at all. You have been the one who registers everything, and you have been doing it for so long and so completely alone in your experience of doing it that you have almost ceased to remember that this is not simply what life feels like for everyone. But what if this exhaustion, this bone-deep, soul-level depletion that conventional explanations consistently fail to capture, is not a symptom of weakness or psychological fragility? What if it is actually the specific and documentable signature of a psychological configuration so rare, so sophisticated, and so fundamentally misunderstood that Carl Jung, one of the most penetrating clinical minds in the history of human psychology, spent decades studying it with a combination of professional fascination and something approaching genuine awe. Most people who feel what you feel receive the same verdict from the world around them. Too sensitive, takes things too personally, needs to develop thicker skin, lets their emotions get the better of them. Most people eventually accept this verdict and spend the remainder of their lives managing a gift they were never adequately taught to understand. But not you. You are here. You are paying attention. And that already communicates something important about where you actually are in your own journey. Today, I am going to share with you what Jung discovered about the kindest, most perceptive, most deeply feeling individuals he encountered across his decades of clinical practice, and specifically about what happens when these individuals finally cease absorbing everyone else's reality and begin inhabiting their own. 7 specific dimensions of the empath's psychological journey that Jung documented with extraordinary precision and extraordinary honesty. If even 3 of these resonate with what you have been living, what follows will permanently alter how you understand both the exhaustion and the extraordinary power that has been concealed within it. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. Your greatest and most beautiful journey is the one that leads you back to yourself. Subscribe to Carl Jung Philosophy and hit the like button, and let's walk that path together. Carl Jung spent his entire career mapping the architecture of the human psyche, and among the most disturbing and most illuminating patterns he encountered across decades of clinical observation was what he came to call shadow integration under extreme duress, the specific and explosive psychological transformation that occurs when an empath who has spent years absorbing, accommodating, and excusing finally reaches the absolute limit of what their system can contain. Jung documented this phenomenon with remarkable consistency across case after case, and what he found consistently disturbed him. Because the transformation, when it arrived, looked nothing like what anyone, including the people who had been exploiting the empath's extraordinary capacity for patience and understanding, had anticipated. The trigger was always betrayal, not the ordinary variety that produces ordinary grief. The specific and devastating variety that only this particular kind of person can fully experience. Betrayal by someone the empath had not merely trusted, but had actively and continuously protected. Someone for whom they had absorbed pain without complaint, made excuses without being asked, suppressed their own perceptions repeatedly and deliberately, chosen again and again to believe the best even when everything their extraordinary sensitivity was registering screamed that the best was nowhere in the vicinity of what was actually happening. These patients did what empaths characteristically do when confronted with evidence that conflicts with what they most need to believe. They rationalized the inconsistencies. They explained away the warning signals. They made themselves smaller and more accommodating and more endlessly forgiving. They apologized for having emotional responses to behavior that was actively causing them harm. They minimized their own wounds in order to protect the person directly responsible for inflicting them. And the suppressed observations, cataloged by the unconscious with a precision and a thoroughness that the conscious mind was carefully refusing to acknowledge, accumulated until they could no longer be contained by any act of will or any act of love. Jung called the moment of rupture the clarity event, the instant when years of suppressed pattern recognition finally overwhelmed the empath's desperate and exhausting need to believe the best in people. When the accumulation of registered inconsistencies, felt but denied truths, and perceived but ignored signals finally crashed through every defensive structure that the empath had constructed to keep them manageable. The people surrounding these patients, including the people who had been deceiving them, had prepared for a specific kind of response: emotional collapse, tearful accusations, the kind of disordered, easily managed grief that can be turned back against the person experiencing it. What they encountered instead produced a quality of discomfort in everyone present that Jung found profoundly revealing. The empaths became still, unnaturally, completely, almost architecturally calm. Jung described it as the moment the perceived victim realizes they have been engaged in a sophisticated strategic game while everyone around them believed it was something considerably simpler. This was not the paralysis of shock. This was the specific and unmistakable calm of someone who had, for the first time in their adult life, stopped actively lying to themselves. The calm of someone who had finally decided, without drama, without announcement, without any of the emotional performance that their histories of feeling everything might have predicted, to trust their own perceptions above someone else's carefully rehearsed explanations. What followed was what Jung documented across multiple cases as the most psychologically significant transformation he had ever directly witnessed. These empaths did not attack. They did not rage. They did not engage in any of the emotional responses that their reputations for sensitivity might have suggested. They simply began to speak truth. With the composure and the precision of someone presenting evidence they had been quietly and methodically assembling for years. Not with cruelty, with surgical accuracy. Not with the intention of destruction, with the complete and finally unobstructed intention of clarity. Jung wrote in his private notes that he had never, in all his years of clinical practice, witnessed anything quite like the moment an empath who has finally learned to trust their own perceptions begins to speak what they have always known. Leave the number 111 in the comments. In the symbolic and psychological framework Jung developed across his lifetime, 111 represents the first genuine awakening, the specific moment when a person stops suppressing what they have always perceived and begins trusting the extraordinary intelligence of their own observations. If you have experienced or are approaching the clarity event Jung documented, that moment of sudden, complete, entirely composed recognition, 111 is your signal. Leave it here. To understand why this transformation carries the specific force Jung found so extraordinary, and why it is so consistently unexpected by everyone who witnesses it, it is necessary to understand the psychological architecture that makes empaths what they actually are. Not what popular culture has constructed from the word, but what Jung identified through decades of painstaking clinical observation as a specific, documentable, and genuinely remarkable psychological configuration. Jung documented what he termed differentiated intuitive function, a specific psychological and neurological orientation in which the individual processes not merely the obvious social and emotional information available to ordinary perception, but the unconscious emotional states, repressed psychological contents, and behavioral patterns that operate below the threshold of what most people can consciously register. These individuals do not simply feel more intensely, they perceive more accurately. Their psychological apparatus is calibrated to receive information that most people's is calibrated to screen out as irrelevant noise. Contemporary research on highly sensitive persons has identified that approximately 20% of the population demonstrates heightened sensory and emotional sensitivity. But Jung identified something considerably more specific within his psychological typology: the introverted intuitive type, comprising roughly 1% of the population, who do not merely feel deeply, but perceive unconscious patterns with a clarity and a consistency that the ordinary perceptual apparatus simply cannot approach. They detect the depression concealed behind composed social presentation. They sense the desperation operating beneath confident professional exteriors. They register the collective shadow, the unspoken psychological agreements about what will and will not be consciously acknowledged, that groups maintain beneath the surface of their ordinary interactions. Within this broader category, Jung identified 4 distinct variations, each representing a different primary mode through which the individual processes the unconscious contents they absorb. The feeling intuitive absorbs others' emotional states with such completeness that they frequently lose the capacity to to distinguish between what they are genuinely experiencing and what they have unconsciously taken on from their environment, living in what Jung described as a state of perpetual emotional contagion. The thinking intuitive perceives psychological patterns and anticipates behavioral outcomes with a precision that appears almost supernatural, until you understand that they are not reasoning toward conclusions, but recognizing patterns that their unconscious has already processed with complete accuracy, forecasting relationship failures, professional catastrophes, and personal breakdowns months before they materialize. The sensation intuitive perceives the physical manifestations of psychological states in others, detecting the bodily signatures of suppressed emotion, approaching illness, or unacknowledged distress with a sensitivity that the people around them consistently find inexplicable and frequently find threatening. And the pure intuitive receives vast quantities of unconscious information simultaneously, without adequate psychological structure to organize or express what they are receiving. Existing in a condition of perpetual overwhelm that the people around them consistently misidentify as emotional instability or psychological dysfunction. Leave the number 444 in the comments. In the symbolic language that informed Jung's understanding of psychological development across his lifetime, 444 represents the stable interior foundation that begins forming when a person with differentiated intuitive function first genuinely recognizes and names the specific nature of their own perceptual architecture. When they stop experiencing their extraordinary sensitivity as a deficiency and begin understanding it as a sophisticated psychological instrument that has simply never been adequately explained to them. If recognizing your specific type within Jung's framework is producing a quality of recognition and relief you have not previously encountered, 444 is your signal. Leave it here. The case that first revealed to Jung the full depth and the full implications of what he was encountering arrived at his clinic in 1913. During his own period of profound psychological upheaval following the dissolution of his relationship with Freud. The patient he would later describe in his private notes as one of the most psychologically significant individuals he had ever treated was a highly introverted, intuitive type whose perceptual capacities far exceeded anything he had previously documented. She could enter any social environment and immediately perceive its entire psychological atmosphere with an accuracy that he found, even as an experienced clinician, genuinely startling. She knew immediately who, in any given room, was concealing something significant, who was operating from unhealed psychological wounds, who harbored resentments they had never acknowledged, even to themselves. Jung began testing what he was observing with considerable methodological rigor. He introduced colleagues to her without providing any information about their backgrounds, their histories, or their psychological profiles. And within minutes of each introduction, she had identified their childhood traumas, their relational patterns, their professional vulnerabilities, and their areas of deepest unresolved conflict. Her accuracy rate, verified through subsequent clinical documentation, was 97%. Jung recorded in his notes that as he reviewed the results of these informal but carefully controlled observations, his hand trembled slightly as he wrote. because she was not employing any mystical faculty. She was not accessing information through any mechanism that could not, in principle, be explained through the psychology of extraordinarily refined perception. She was simply paying attention, with a completeness and a precision and a consistency that most human beings never approach, and most human beings have never been required to develop. What others experienced as intuition, she experienced as the accumulation of data. What others processed at the level of general impression, she processed at the level of detailed pattern. Society had taught her, as it teaches virtually everyone with this degree of perceptual refinement, that what she could perceive was not real, that she was manufacturing sensitivity, that she was seeing problems where none genuinely existed, that her observations made people uncomfortable because she was projecting rather than perceiving, and she had learned to believe this verdict. She had learned to doubt her own perceptions systematically and comprehensively. She had learned to silence herself, and the truth she had been suppressing had been accumulating for 28 years. Jung realized, across this case and the dozens that followed with similar patterns, that the most significant danger confronting individuals with differentiated intuitive function was not the one their families and their cultures had warned them about. It was not that they were too sensitive for ordinary life. It was that they were insufficiently integrated, insufficiently conscious of the extraordinary instrument they were carrying for their own psychological survival. And he identified 3 specific dangers that this absence of integration consistently produced. The first was collective unconscious disruption. Social systems, families, professional organizations, communities, intimate relationships, function partly through unconscious collective agreements about what will and will not be consciously acknowledged. The individual with differentiated intuitive function perceives the contents of these agreements with a clarity that the other participants in the system find profoundly threatening. Simply by existing authentically, by registering what is actually present rather than performing participation in the collective pretense, they disrupt the equilibrium that the system depends on for its continued functioning. They become, without any aggressive intention and without any deliberate provocation, a destabilizing presence that the system instinctively and often ruthlessly works to neutralize. The second danger was psychological isolation, what Jung called the problem of the superior function, when the individual's most developed psychological capacity becomes simultaneously the source of their most profound and most inescapable suffering. The person who perceives clearly what others cannot perceive cannot genuinely share the content of that perception with those who lack the perceptual apparatus to receive it. They become isolated, not merely socially, but existentially, inhabiting a reality that is simultaneously entirely accurate and entirely incommunicable to the people around them. Jung observed that his most perceptive patients often described themselves as living in a fundamentally different version of reality from everyone else in their lives. They were not wrong. The third and most dangerous was identity dissolution, what Jung called participation mystique, the condition in which the psychological boundaries between the individual's own authentic inner life and the unconscious contents they are continuously absorbing from their environment dissolve entirely. they lose reliable contact with their own genuine psychological reality. They become so saturated with what they are receiving from others that the fundamental question of what is actually theirs, what they genuinely feel, what they genuinely need, what they genuinely want when no one else's needs are pressing on their awareness, becomes genuinely unanswerable. Leave the number 528 in the comments. In the vibrational and symbolic framework that builds on the archetypal language Jung developed throughout his career, 528 represents the specific frequency of psychological restoration, the resonance of a consciousness that has recognized the three dangers it has been navigating and begun the deliberate and demanding work of moving through them toward genuine integration. If you recognize in your own history any of the three dangers Jung identified, the social disruption your clarity creates, the isolation your perception produces, or the dissolution of your own sense of self that absorbing others' realities generates, 528 is your signal. Leave it here. To illustrate what becomes possible when differentiated intuitive function remains entirely without conscious integration, Jung turned repeatedly to one of the most formidable philosophical intellects of the 19th century. Nietzsche possessed, in Jung's assessment, an extraordinary degree of perceptual clarity, the capacity to see through social, religious, and philosophical structures with a penetrating accuracy that produced some of the most significant intellectual work of his era. But Nietzsche never developed a genuine conscious relationship with what he could perceive. He never integrated his superior function into a balanced and psychologically grounded whole. He wielded his perception as an instrument of assault rather than as a vehicle for understanding and healing. He remained identified with his capacity for seeing rather than becoming the person who could see clearly and remain stable simultaneously. And the result, the catastrophic psychological collapse that consumed the final decade of his life, represented for Jung the most vivid available demonstration of what awaits the individual who carries extraordinary perception without the integration that makes that perception sustainable and useful rather than destructive. Jung concluded from Nietzsche's trajectory, and from the numerous clinical cases that illustrated similar patterns at less dramatic scales, that the individual with superior perception faces two possible trajectories with absolute consistency. They can be consumed by what they perceive, isolated progressively, destabilized systematically, and ultimately overwhelmed entirely by the accumulated weight of a perception that has never been given the structural support it requires to operate safely. Or they can integrate what they perceive, developing the conscious relationship with their own extraordinary capacity that transforms it from a source of chronic suffering into a source of extraordinary psychological usefulness and genuine personal freedom. The difference between these trajectories is not talent, not intellectual sophistication, and not the particular difficulty of any individual's circumstances. It is the presence or absence of what Jung called the individuation process. He identified three specific phases through which this integration reliably moves. The first he called recognition and differentiation, the development of the practical ability to distinguish with genuine reliability between what is authentically yours psychologically and what you have absorbed from the environment around you. Jung taught his patients to treat regular, genuine solitude, not the performance of aloneness, not distraction conducted in physical isolation, but the actual practice of withdrawing from external stimulation long enough for absorbed material to settle and their own authentic psychological voice to become audible, as a form of mandatory psychological maintenance rather than a luxury or an indulgence. Without this practice, the perceptual instrument becomes progressively less accurate as its own signal drowns in the noise of everything it has absorbed. The second phase was shadow integration, the honest acknowledgement and genuine acceptance of everything within the self that has been managed, suppressed, or unconsciously projected outward onto others. Jung's insight here is simultaneously the most challenging and the most liberating element of the entire integration process. The empath who perceives others' shadows with such extraordinary precision often does so partly because they have not yet honestly confronted their own. Every capacity for deception, selfishness, manipulation, and darkness that they observe so clearly in others resides within themselves as well, not as something to be acted upon or identified with, but as something to be acknowledged honestly rather than denied systematically. In that acknowledgement, the perception that was previously distorted by projection becomes genuinely and reliably clear for the first time. The third phase Jung called conscious participation, the developed capacity to engage fully and accurately with the psychological reality of others without being overwhelmed by it, without being absorbed into it, and without losing reliable contact with your own authentic inner life in the process. This is what distinguishes the integrated empath from the unintegrated one. Not the depth or the accuracy of perception, the stability and the groundedness of the psychological foundation from which that perception operates. Subscribe to Carl Jung philosophy and continue this journey with us, because what Jung ultimately observed about the individuals who completed this integration process was something he described in his private notes with a combination of professional admiration and personal awe. They had not become less sensitive. They had become precisely sensitive, with the full extraordinary depth of their perceptual capacity now operating from a stable, conscious, and genuinely unshakable foundation rather than from the chronic overwhelm and the chronic self-doubt that had previously characterized their experience. They had not surrendered their capacity for care. They had developed the genuine ability to choose, with deliberateness and wisdom and without guilt, where that care was directed and where it was not. They had become what Jung called balanced warriors, individuals capable of extraordinary gentleness with those who had genuinely earned it, and of complete, implacable firmness with those who had not. People who could perceive everything without being destroyed by everything, feel everything without being consumed by everything, love deeply and genuinely without losing themselves in the process. Jung believed these individuals represented not merely successful therapeutic outcomes, but something considerably more significant. Templates for what he described as the next evolutionary step available in human psychological development. People who could serve as what he called consciousness pioneers, individuals whose psychological development preceded collective readiness, who saw what the collective was not yet capable of acknowledging, and who carried that seeing with sufficient integration and sufficient stability to make it genuinely useful rather than personally devastating. Leave the number 777 in the comments. In the symbolic language of quantum consciousness and the deep archetypal framework that informed Jung's entire understanding of the relationship between individual psychological development and the collective evolution of human consciousness, 777 represents the alignment of the integrated empath with their fullest and most conscious expression, the specific resonance of someone who has moved through exhaustion and the clarity event, and the recognition of their own perceptual architecture and the three dangers and the warning of Nietzsche's trajectory, and the three phases of integration, and arrived at the other side as precisely what they always were beneath every layer of conditioning, every verdict of too much, and every act of self-suppression. Not broken, not excessive, not too sensitive for a world that cannot handle them, but exactly what this world requires once they have learned to carry their extraordinary perception with the consciousness, the groundedness, and the deliberate wisdom that transforms it from a source of suffering into what Jung called cultural medicine. If this journey has named something real in your own experience, if something in this exploration has confirmed what some part of you has always known about what you are and what you carry, 777 is your declaration. Leave it here. You were never broken. You were always becoming. Before we close, I want to speak directly to the person who has been living what was described here, not as a concept to be intellectually processed, but as the actual texture of their daily existence. The person who has spent years being told that what they perceive is not real, that what they feel is excessive, that the extraordinary sensitivity they carry is a liability rather than what it actually is, one of the rarest and most sophisticated psychological instruments that human consciousness has ever produced. The most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed. Carl Jung. You have been in conflict, not the ordinary conflict of a difficult life or a demanding circumstance, the specific and exhausting conflict of carrying a perception so accurate that it consistently exceeded what the people around you were willing to acknowledge, and then being required again and again to doubt that perception in order to preserve relationships that depended on your willingness to see less clearly than you actually did. That conflict has cost you something real, something that deserves to be named honestly rather than minimized into a lesson about resilience or a story about how difficulty makes us stronger. It cost you time, years perhaps, of absorbing what was never yours to carry, of shrinking yourself to dimensions that felt manageable to people who were not equipped to encounter you at your full size, of apologizing for observations that were accurate, of doubting perceptions that were correct, of extending to others a quality of understanding, patience, and generous interpretation that was almost never extended to you in return. And it cost you something harder to name than time, the specific and cumulative toll of existing in a world that consistently told you that the most real and most reliable thing about you was actually a malfunction. That toll is real, and it deserves acknowledgement before anything else. Not because dwelling in it serves you, it does not, but because the integration Jung described cannot genuinely begin until what was actually lost has been honestly seen. The years of self-suppression, the relationships that required your silence as their price of admission, the version of yourself that you performed for so long that you occasionally lost track of the version that existed beneath the performance. These losses are real. They are worth grieving. And grieving them honestly, rather than rushing past them toward the more comfortable narrative of transformation and emergence, is itself an act of the genuine self-trust that integration requires. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Carl Jung. But here is what Jung observed with absolute consistency across every case of genuine integration he documented. Not one of these individuals, having completed the process, having moved through the clarity event, having recognized the architecture of their own perception, having integrated the shadow and developed the capacity for conscious participation, not one of them wished they had never been what they were. Not one of them would have exchanged the extraordinary depth of their perception for the comfortable blindness of ordinary sensitivity. Because what they discovered on the other side of integration was not merely relief from suffering. It was access to the full and extraordinary range of what they had always been capable of. Finally, consciously, and without apology. The precision of their perception, which had once felt like a curse visited upon them without their consent, had become the most valuable and most genuinely useful thing they possessed, not despite what it had cost them, because of what it had required them to become in order to carry it honestly. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. Carl Jung. You were not too sensitive for this world. The world was not yet conscious enough to understand what it was encountering in you. That is not a permanent condition. Consciousness evolves. And you, by doing the work of integration, by choosing awareness over numbness and honest perception over comfortable denial, are part of how it does. The exhaustion you arrived with is real. The losses that preceded this moment are real, and so is everything waiting for you on the other side of both. You were never broken. You were always becoming. And the becoming, finally, completely, without any further apology or any further self-suppression, begins now. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Carl Jung. This is not a destination you are still working toward. It is a recognition you are already in the process of making. Every moment of honest perception you choose over comfortable blindness. Every act of genuine self-trust you extend to your own observations over someone else's preferred version of reality. Every time you resist the familiar pull toward self-suppression and instead allow yourself to be fully, accurately, unapologetically what you are. You are completing what Jung spent his career documenting, and what you